In the hush of a late Columbus evening, Officer Linda Carson believed she ruled the darkness. The night was quiet, only a few stray headlights and the murmur of distant engines disturbed its stillness. Parked near a vacant lot, she watched time slow until a sleek black sedan, as if gliding on liquid night, crossed her path. Its glossy finish whispered of luxury, and though nothing seemed amiss, except the driver's failure to signal, it offered a pretext to enforce the law. Determined to assert control, Linda steered her cruiser into action, her flashing lights a signal of impending order. As the sedan eased to a stop, Linda stepped out with measured resolve, one hand resting on her belt, the other adjusting her radio as if tuning into a private frequency of authority. The street, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and punctuated only by the distant hum of passing vehicles, now became the stage for an unfolding drama. Slowly, the driver's window descended, revealing a man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet affluence. His hands, resting lightly on the steering wheel, betrayed no sign of panic, only a calm that challenged her expectations. License and registration. Linda's tone came out firmer than she had intended, her words clipped like a command. The man's eyes, steady and unflinching, met hers. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" he inquired in a voice that flowed smooth as velvet yet carried an undercurrent of defiance. Linda's heart tightened, a subtle shift of power that left her momentarily disoriented. His quiet inquiry, neither rude nor aggressive, ignited an unexpected spark of irritation within her. After a brief, weighted pause, she repeated her demand, her arms folding like the closing of a book that refused to be read. The man's measured calm was an affront, an unspoken challenge to her authority. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. His barely audible exhale, a sound that felt more like a statement than a sigh, answered her query. In that charged moment, memories of over a decade on the force surged through her, experiences that warned her of defiance, yet this calm defiance unsettled her deeply. With a curt gesture, Linda ordered him to step out of the vehicle. The man's expression shifted subtly, a fleeting tightening of his jaw, a slight tilt of his head, but he complied, unbuckling his seatbelt with deliberate care and stepping onto the cool pavement. As he moved toward the trunk, placing his hands against its cool metal surface in a quiet, measured rhythm, Linda's control began to slip. In a heartbeat, driven by an overwhelming need to reassert her authority, her hand lashed out. Her palm connected with his cheek in a sharp, stinging crack, a sound that shattered the night's fragile silence and sent a shiver through the charged air. For a suspended moment, time stuttered. The man's head jerked to the side, his body freezing in a tableau of stunned disbelief. Then, as if emerging from the depths of a hidden reserve, he slowly retrieved his ID from his jacket pocket. Linda's blood turned to ice as her eyes scanned the document, Nathaniel Grant, Chief of Police. Her breath caught in her throat. In one devastating instant, the target of her misdirected fury was revealed to be not merely a civilian, but her superior. Before she could process the mounting implications, a siren's wail and the flashing lights of another patrol car cut through the tension. Officer Reynolds, her familiar partner, stepped forward with a furrowed brow. "Everything all right here, Officer Carson?" he asked, his tone laced with perplexity. Linda's internal world spun, a tangled mix of anger, shame, and disbelief, as the weight of her impulsive act pressed upon her like an avalanche. Reynolds' eyes darted between the two figures, but the unspoken gravity in Nathaniel Grant's still, measured gaze left no room for simple explanations. In the days that followed, Linda's nights became a ceaseless loop of restless sleep and gnawing regret. The image of Chief Grant's impassive eyes haunted her, a silent accusation that echoed in every thought. A terse message arrived from Internal Affairs, a summons to the chief's office that felt more like a death knell than a mere meeting notice. The drive to the station was a blur of heavy silence and anxious anticipation, every red light and every passing phase in the precinct deepened the chasm of her remorse. Within the austere confines of Grant's office, the atmosphere was frigid and unyielding. Seated across from him was Captain Howard, a stalwart veteran whose unreadable expression weighed down the room. As Linda's voice trembled with forced attachment, Grant's inquiry sliced through the silence. "Tell me, Officer Carson, how would you report last night's stop?" With each measured word, Linda's confession spilled forth, a routine stop that had spiraled into chaos because she had, in a moment of weakness, struck a man who dared to meet her unwavering gaze with calm defiance. The conversation was punctuated by long pauses and loaded silences, each one intensifying the gravity of her actions. At length, without a trace of malice, Grant slid a crisp piece of paper across the desk, a suspension notice that rendered her future uncertain. "You're off duty until further notice," he stated in a tone that was both icy and sorrowful. As his words sank in, Linda's body betrayed her inner turmoil. She felt as though the ground beneath her had split open, leaving her suspended in a void of shame and regret. That night, in the solitude of her small apartment, Linda replayed the events over and over. The echo of her palm against that man's cheek, the unyielding calm in his eyes, and the heavy, deliberate silence that followed, all fused into a nightmare from which she could not awake. Then, as if summoned by fate, her phone buzzed with a message, a terse invitation from Chief Grant: "Meet me at Riverside Park. 10 minutes." With her heart pounding like distant thunder, she pulled on her jacket and stepped into the chill night. At Riverside Park, the sparse glow of streetlights cast elongated shadows across a nearly empty scene. Joggers, a couple on a bench, and a lone dog walker were the only witnesses as Linda approached the solitary figure standing by the river. There, with his hands deep in his pockets and eyes fixed on the gently flowing water beneath a weathered bridge, stood Nathaniel Grant. He did not immediately acknowledge her presence. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the soft murmur of the river, a quiet witness to their unspoken history. "You called me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as the cool night air mingled with her racing thoughts. Grant's nod was subtle, his eyes still fixed on the dark current. "Do you know why I didn't report what happened immediately?" he finally asked, his voice measured and soft, yet laden with an unyielding gravity. Linda's throat constricted as she grappled with the truth. "I wondered," she admitted, "why it was handled so quietly." Grant's reply was quiet and resolute: "Because I wanted you to sit with it, to truly feel the weight of what you did before seeking an escape." Under the sparse glow of park lamps, their conversation unfolded slowly, each word a blade carving through layers of long-hidden biases and unspoken assumptions. Grant pressed her with questions that dug deep into the recesses of her conscience, questions about the roots of her anger, about the silent prejudices that had steered her hand that fateful night. His probing was neither punitive nor overtly harsh, it was an invitation, a demand for introspection that left Linda with a stark choice. She could dismiss it as a transient error or confront the painful truths that lay beneath her professional facade. In the days that followed, Linda drifted in a haze of isolation. When the call from Internal Affairs finally arrived, a formal report that chilled her to the core, she drove to the station with a numb sense of inevitability. Inside the sterile conference room, bathed in the hum of hushed conversations and sidelong glances, she sat before Investigator Harris, Captain Howard, and Chief Grant. The interrogation was clinical, each question a surgical incision into her memory. With trembling candor, she recounted the sequence: a minor traffic infraction escalated by her misjudgment, a moment when frustration eclipsed reason. Her words were met with measured silence until Harris's gaze turned piercingly toward her. "At what point did you escalate to physical force?" he demanded, his tone even yet unforgiving. Linda's voice faltered as she confessed, "I struck the suspect." The room filled with a heavy silence, punctuated only by the distant echoes of her racing heartbeat. In that suffocating moment, Chief Grant's gaze was the only one that cut deeper than any spoken accusation. "Why did you hit me, Officer Carson?" he finally murmured, the question hanging in the air like an accusation she could neither deny nor fully comprehend. The ensuing deliberation was a blur of terse statements and cold, measured judgment. In the end, Linda was handed a fate that felt both damning and oddly merciful: a minimum suspension of 60 days without pay, coupled with mandatory de-escalation and bias training. With a nod that betrayed both resignation and a flicker of hope, she accepted the penalty, knowing that the journey toward redemption had only just begun. The first day of training was an exercise in humility. In a cramped classroom filled with a mix of rookies and veterans, a retired detective, Joanna Pierce, whose presence was as commanding as it was enigmatic, projected a grainy video of a traffic stop gone awry. The footage, captured from a body camera, showed an officer escalating a routine interaction into chaos. When Joanna's voice finally broke the silence, she asked, "What did the officer see when he pulled that man over?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. In that charged moment, all eyes turned to Linda, whose internal struggle was mirrored in the haunted silence of the room. When Joanna pressed further, "And what did you see when you pulled that man over?" Linda's voice emerged barely above a whisper, a threat. The instructor's eyes softened as she probed, "And was he?" Linda's internal battle waged as she realized the truth was more complex, a reflection of ingrained assumptions and the legacy of years of unexamined bias. The silence that followed was as piercing as any condemnation, forcing Linda to confront that prejudice is rarely loud or overt, it often lurks in the shadows of our everyday decisions. 2 months later, the precinct hummed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, boots tapping on tiled floors, low conversations drifting through the air. Linda returned to her post, a changed officer bearing the weight of hard-earned introspection. As she settled at her desk, a familiar shadow passed by, a silent acknowledgement. At the threshold of his office, Nathaniel Grant paused and, after a brief moment of contemplation, said simply, "Carson, welcome back." That single phrase, delivered without triumph or scorn, carried a world of unspoken promises and the possibility of renewal. Later, as Linda sat alone in her car reflecting on the day's quiet moments, she understood that the real reckoning was just beginning. The true challenge was not the slap on the wrist but the long road toward understanding that bias is insidious. It does not always roar with hate but sometimes whispers in the quiet assumptions of everyday life. The choice before her was stark. She could walk away and pretend it was a mere mistake, or she could face the truth, rebuild her identity, and let this moment redefine her future. If this story stirred something deep within you, share it. Let's spark the conversations that truly matter, discussions that challenge our assumptions, break the silence, and build a bridge toward a more honest, reflective future.